The second essential difference between East and West revolves around the concept of agency. Visual cultures influence the physiological recognition of visual patterns not only at the superficial level of objects and themes, but also at a deeper level of agency conceptualization and attribution. Abstract and yet fundamental differences stand out in comparing the Western and the Eastern tradition of imaginative stones. For most Western sources, the prodigy does not consist merely in the fact that some stones resemble certain aspects of reality, be they human beings, animals, or landscapes. Prodigious stones must also contain icons. They must include an intentional effigies that resemble not reality itself, but intentional representations of it produced by artists. That is why painting, and not sculpture, is the Western epitome of art that nature should imitate in its spontaneous playfulness. Western sources usually relate not of stones openly displaying prodigious icons, but of stones that, cut in two halves, reveal prodigious icons in their core, as if these art-like effigies were an immemorial secret kept by nature until it was accidentally discovered. The idea that artistic forms must not be created, but rather found in marble, is a topos in the history of Western art, and especially Western sculpture, cherished by Michelangelo and many others. However, in the tradition of imaginative stones, the sculpture's work becomes unnecessary. Nature itself discloses the artistic form that lies in its nucleus. A human procedure, cutting the stone, leads to the discovery, but unintentionally. The unintentional dimension of artistic creation is transferred from nature to humans. Suseki does not usually imply speculation about what force might have inscribed in stones an image that looks like those produced by human agency. In Western sources, on the contrary, the question is central. Identification of prodigious images in nature immediately leads to consider them as signs of a separate dimension which imprints its creativity on the former. Debate among artists and philosophers is particularly controversial as regards the so-called chance images, that is, images that have not been found in nature but have been produced through random human procedures. One of the first accounts of images of such kind is, again, Pliny the Elder. Book 35 of the Natural History recounts an episode in the life of Protogenes, one of the greatest painters in the Western artistic tradition, but also one of the most punctilious. In painting what is considered his most accomplished work, a picture of Lalisus, the artist was perfectly satisfied with every aspect of the painting, except for one single element, that is, the foam on the muzzle of a dog represented therein. Its depiction was too perfect to look natural. It seemed artificial. Desperate with painting and repainting the same detail with no avail, Protogenes eventually threw a sponge at the painting, and the irregular stain that the gesture produced painted perfectly spontaneous foam on the muzzle of a dog. The irrational gesture proved so effective that it subsequently turned into a conventional technique for the production of random images. Later on, as Pliny points it out, Nealces used the same expedient to paint foam on a horse's mouth, and of course, many centuries later, Pollock too. The episode is to be categorized as one of the countless artist legends. It nevertheless reveals a key factor of Western aesthetics, characterizing its conception of the arts at least since the Greeks. On the one hand, the episode suggests that human creativity is intrinsically limited in imitating nature. Certain aspects of nature, like foam on the muzzle of a dog, are so infinitely complex as to appear chaotic. Any intentional, rational procedure of representation tends to reduce that complexity into a simplified simulacrum of it, thus replacing the idea and the image of chaos with those of order. That is the reason for which the only way in which artists can represent the chaos of nature is to let that chaos represent itself. Artists can imitate the Ludus Naturae, the playfulness of nature, by inviting nature itself to play in their own representation of it. As imaginative stones, thus, chance images result from an ontological ideology that constantly tends to single out two separate dimensions in reality. On the one hand, manifestation, on the other hand, an agency that mysteriously works in another dimension but produces effects in the manifested one. No paintings by protagonists are extant. It is therefore impossible to know how the foam on the muzzle of Lalisus' dog might have looked like. Arguably, protagonists longed for a visual and artistic effect quite similar to that which Japanese aesthetics denominates, but very rarely defines, as wabi-sabi. In order for the pictorial representation of foam to look authentic, it should not possess the characteristics of finitude, perfection, and conclusiveness that Protagoras so skillfully used to achieve in his works, so as to perfectly represent the infinite and unfathomable complexity of nature. Imperfection had to be let in the painting. A perfect depiction of nature should have contained imperfection. Yet the pictorial skills of Protagoras' meticulousness were unable to produce it. The random gesture of throwing a sponge at the painting found a natural solution to the impasse through the intervention of natura ludens, playful nature. The wabi-sabi visual effect produced by Protagoras' sponge must have been quite similar to the infinitely multifarious patterns of shapes, colors, and textures that characterize Japanese raku pottery. The production of raku pottery, too, indeed, stems from an irreducibly complex interplay between the initiative of the potter and nature, represented by one of its most uncontrollable elements, that is, fire. It was exactly this interplay that fascinated Western potters when Japanese anagama kilns were first introduced in Europe. That happened through labyrinthine paths. One of the Western authors that most popularized Japanese aesthetics in Europe between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, and particularly after it became extremely fashionable at the 1900 Paris Exposition Universelle, was Lafcadio Hearn, also known as Koizumi Yakumo. It was exactly through reading Hearn's books that Bernard Leach, currently considered as the father of British studio pottery, became interested in Japan, traveled to the country, and after attending a raku pottery party about 1911, undertook studying this art under Urano Shigekichi, also known as Kenzen VI, in the tradition of Kyoto potter Ogata Kensan. So, unlike modern Western pottery kilns, anagama kilns are fueled with firewood, which produces not only the heat that is necessary for pottery, but also fly ash and volatile salts. The natural ash glaze that is distinctive of raku pottery aesthetics results from the unpredictably complex interplay between flame, ash, and the minerals of the clay body in anagama kilns. Since this body will receive a different glaze depending on its position in the kiln and in relation to other clay bodies, loading the anagama is one of the most difficult tasks in raku pottery. Its wabi-sabi aesthetics stem from the infinite variables of the encounter between human choice and the uncontrollable agency of natural elements. So what is my point here? My point here that once again we see a similarity between the aesthetics of the West and the aesthetics of the East. And this similarity is once again linked to a cognitive, innate drive of the human species, which is that to attribute an agency, an anthropomorphic agency, to non-human elements in the environment. When we throw a sponge at a painting, like Protagoras did when he was unable to complete his painting, we believe that there is a mysterious force that the Greeks would call chance, completing the painting instead of the painter. But the same instinct, the same cognitive endowment of the species pushes Japanese potters to believe that the final pottery will be the result of a cooperation between human beings and nature, between the way in which the potter situates the clay bodies in the anagama kilns and the completely uncontrollable way in which fire will dance among these clay bodies. So this is again a common aesthetic feature, but there is also, once again, the necessity to differentiate. To resume, I will quote another of my sources, Dio Chrysostom, who wrote a very famous treatise in Western philosophy called Peritiuches Protos Logos, the first discourse on fortune. It is a work entirely devoted to chance, to fortune, and to the differences between chance and fortune. Dio Chrysostom relates similar episodes to that related by Pliny the Elder, but attributes it to another mythical painter of antiquity, Roman Greco antiquity, Apelles. Apelles was also unable to complete his painting because the blood upon the froth of a horse he was depicting, it was not natural enough. And so he threw himself a sponge at the painting, and the sponge completed the painting for Apelles. And Dio Chrysostom concludes, and at the side Apelles was delighted by what fortune had accomplished in his moment of despair and finished his painting, not through his art, but through the aid of fortune. Now, what is the difference here between the East and the West in the way chance is let into the creation of the work of art? Well, my point here is that the Western artist throws the sponge exactly like the boxer does. The boxer throws the sponge when he's defeated. And in all these stories in the Western tradition, nature is invited into the creation of the work of art as a rival of the artist. The artist cannot complete the work of art, so nature must come in. The artist is defeated, throws the sponge, the nature comes in, chance comes in and completes the painting. In the Eastern aesthetics, the idea of the cooperation between the artist and nature is not the idea of a rivalry, but it's the idea of sort of a symbiosis, sort of a dance, a cooperation with no hierarchical competition. Now, one of the texts that most distinctively indicates this Western attitude, this attitude in Western aesthetics, is a passage in Cicero's De Divinatione, a book entirely devoted on divination. And at some stage, Cicero asks, I'm going to read this quotation because it's absolutely fundamental for our discourse. But what, you ask Carneades, why these things so happen, or by what rules they may be understood? I confess that I do not know, but they do so fall out, I assert, that you yourself see. Mere accidents, you say. Now, really, is that so? Can anything be an accident which bears upon itself every mark of truth? 4 dice are cast. I don't know if dice are popular in Japan, but I guess they are. I don't know what is the translation for dice, but 4 dice are cast and a Venus throw results. Now the Venus throw is the throw that results when you throw 2 or 3 or 4 dice and all the dice show a 6 on the top surface. This is the Venus throw. That is chance. But do you think it would be a chance too if in 100 casts you made 100 Venus throws? It is possible for paints flung at random on a canvas to form the outlines of a face. But do you imagine that an accidental scattering of pigments could produce the beautiful portrait of Venus of Cos? Suppose that a hawk should form the letter A on the ground with its snout. The hawk is an animal, it's a cinghiale, I don't know how you say in Japanese. Suppose that the hawk should form the letter A on the ground with its snout. Is that a reason for believing that it would write out Ennius's poem, The Andromache? Carneades used to have a story that once in the Chian quarries, when a stone was split open, the same episode related by Pliny, there appeared the head of the infant god Pan. I grant that the figure may have borne some resemblance to the god, but assuredly the resemblance was not such that you could ascribe the work to a Scopas. For, Cicero concludes, it is undeniably true that no perfect imitation of a thing was ever made by chance. Cicero is essentially a rationalist, is writing about the Roman haruspices, those who claim to see the future in science, the flying of birds or the intestines of animals, and is saying, okay, nature sometimes can produce images, chance sometimes can produce images, but these images will be never as perfect as images produced by human intentionality, by artists' intentionality. So Cicero is strongly affirming the superiority of artists over nature. Nature can sometimes imitate artists, but artists can always and much better imitate nature. Now, this attitude of hierarchical superiority of the artist over nature has characterized, I believe, almost the entire history of Western art until the Impressionists. There is a very famous quote attributed to Cézanne. The quote says, "The landscape thinks itself in me, and I am its consciousness." With Cézanne and the Impressionists, for the first time probably in the history of Western art, the artist does not think of him or herself as someone superior to nature, but as someone who is the humble consciousness of nature. It is an instrument of nature through which nature himself must show itself and represent itself. Now, probably in no other work is the French artist Cézanne's vocation to become the consciousness of nature as evident as in the over 60 oil paintings in which he obsessively depicted Mont Sainte-Victoire, a limestone mountain ridge in the south of France. This mountain was so deep an element in Cézanne's existential landscape that he did not want to merely represent it as a mountain, as the abstract type of a mountain. He strived to depict it as the mountain, as a living being whose uniqueness consisted in continuously escaping a pictorial definition, in perennially fluctuating as counterpart of the artist's consciousness. Now, there is controversy among art historians about the extent to which Cézanne was influenced, as his contemporary impressionists Manet, Pissarro, and Van Gogh certainly were, by Japanese art. There is plenty of historical evidence, though, that Cézanne's idea of becoming the pictorial consciousness of the quintessential mountain of his native landscape came to him after admiring Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji. Indeed, well before that, the 1900 Paris Universal Exhibition made Japanese aesthetics popular in Europe, the Impressionists were the first representative of the so-called Japonism. Through visual cross-fertilization with Japanese prints, they were confirmed not only in their novel way of painting, but also and above all in their revolutionary way of seeing nature and interpreting their relation with it. Cézanne's encounter with Hokusai led him to affirm the symbiosis between painter and landscape in the creation of the artwork. And now I conclude, after this long going back and forth between Europe and Japan. So the neurophysiology of vision and cognition shapes the way in which human beings visually read the environment. A biological instinct, probably selected as adaptive through evolution, pushes them to recognize coherent shapes in chaotic visual patterns and to impute the creation of these shapes to an anthropomorphic agency. In the West as in the East, in Italy as in Japan, human beings have identified faces, bodies, and landscapes in the bizarre chromatic, eidetic, and topologic configurations of stones, clouds, and other natural elements, as though invisible painters and sculptors had depicted the former in the latter. However, culture-specific visual ideologies immediately and deeply mold such cross-cultural instinct of pattern recognition and agency attribution. Giants and mythical monsters are seen in clouds in the West as in the East. Both the Italian 17th century naturalist and the Japanese 17th century painter identify figures of animals and plants in stones. And yet, the ways in which they articulate the semantics of visual recognition, identify its icons, determine its agency, and categorize it in relation to an ontological framework diverge profoundly according to such exquisitely paths of differentiation that only the study of culture together with that of nature can account for. Thank you very much for your patience.